We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome back to Illinois Rising. I'm Pat Hughes of the Illinois Opportunity Project, filling in for the great Dan Proft, who is vacationing this week, so hoping he's having a great time joining me as a co-host today, as a friend of the program, the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute, Mike Lucci. And Mike, no surprise here when we see this all the time in Illinois and in Chicago, another downgrade for the city of Chicago. Does that surprise you in any way?
That's not surprising given the trajectory of the city, given its economic growth being very weak, given the fact that we just saw that the city of Chicago is shrinking in terms of population because so many people are leaving. So with the massive pension debts over the head of taxpayers in Chicago and so many people leaving, I mean, that, to me, that's a recipe for continual downgrades until the city fixes its problems. Yeah,
Fitch Ratings downgraded Chicago just at the end of March. And it's just, more bad news, as you can imagine. And, I'm grateful to have Arlene Bonner, who's the Senior Director of Fitch Ratings, to join us today to talk about this topic. Arlene, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Can you do me a favor? Can you summarize for the listeners who aren't as familiar with this process, what a downgrade is and what factors led to the downgrade?
Sure. So Fitch Ratings maintains a bond rating for the city of Chicago, and that's just a guideline, a help for investors to understand, what level of risk they're taking when they buy the city's bonds. So we recently downgraded the rating to BBB minus with a negative outlook. And the reasons behind that were really because with the recent Supreme Court decision, it seems that the city's options for dealing with its pension problems have really narrowed, and this is going to be a big challenge for them going forward.
Arlene, you mentioned the pension problems. How would you assess the pensions as a part of the overall problems that Chicago faces? And what should the average Chicagoan think, and how should the average Chicagoan understand the downgrade that you're talking about here?
Sure. The pensions, I would say, are really the biggest challenge facing the city. In many ways, the other aspects of the city's credit quality have improved in recent years, but this pension challenge just seems to overshadow whatever improvement they make in that regard. So it's going to continue to be an issue for them, particularly if they aren't in a position where they're starting to put money away for this obligation that they have.
And Arlene, how does the ratings work? In other words, when will the next time your ratings agency will do an evaluation of this and either keep it the same, raise it, or downgrade it? How often does this happen?
Mm-hmm. We keep pretty close tabs on the city's rating, particularly because there seem to be so many, moving parts and things change pretty relatively rapidly. So we're always in touch with them and keeping abreast of recent developments. So the negative outlook that we have on the rating basically says that we think that there is, pretty good chance that the rating may continue to go down within the next year or two. So that is, still a concern. We do think that there is the possibility that the rating could stabilize at that level if the city presents a plan that we think is affordable for them and that is sustainable for the pension system.
Arlene, you mentioned that, as you said, these pensions are an overriding issue, but then you also said that there were a few positive elements. What were those? What should Chicagoans think of when they're looking at the positive elements to consider?
Well, I think in terms of their financial management, the city has definitely weaned itself to a great extent from a lot of the one-time measures that they were relying upon in their budget. They haven't completely eliminated those, but they've made a great deal of progress in that regard. But we would not really consider the budgets to be, sustainably balanced without funding the pensions in a way that makes them on a sound basis going forward.
Okay, well, thank you, Arlene Bonner, Senior Director of Fitch Ratings. Thank you so much for your input today and for joining us. We really appreciate you being on here and giving the listeners some perspective on what is an incredibly important issue. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Mike, it's bad news, right, for the city of Chicago, and by consequence, because the city of Chicago is such a huge part of Illinois' economy, by consequence, it's bad for the state of Illinois. We have to think about prospectively, given that these, as Arlene mentioned, these ratings are going to happen. They're keeping a close watch. What are the policies? And we talk about this all the time at IOP, at IPI, and what are the policies that need to be put in place for this type of negative economic reaction to be abated and then reversed?
Well, when you talk about Chicago, it's almost where to start. But to start with where Arlene was saying the big problem is with the pensions, you need to start looking at amending the state constitution so that you can change pensions, at least on a going forward basis. But the pension liability is so massive for the city and then for the county on top of it, which is also just a tax burden for the city. Pensions definitely have to be dealt with. And then the other side of the budget equation is your revenue. And in terms of revenue, what Chicago needs to look at is more economic growth. So more policies that make it easier to be an entrepreneur, more policies that make it more livable and affordable for families. So examples of those, it just really simplify the licensing and startup process for entrepreneurs and for small businesses, and perhaps lift the zoning regulations on a lot of neighborhoods, which would just make it easier for more families to move in and afford to live in some of Chicago's neighborhoods.
Yes, let's talk a little bit about two things. First, the constitutional amendment situation as it relates to the pension problem. Obviously, the Illinois Supreme Court has struck down the most recent pension reform, I think both in the state and in the city.
Yes.
The reality is a constitutional amendment, at least in the near term, is not a political reality. So short of that, what aside from, raising revenue through economic growth, what is there anything else that can be done relative to the pension, restructuring the pension? Is it just you'd have to renegotiate with all of these public employees? Is that the only way to go about doing it? They're not going to want to do that.
That's right. They're not going to want to do that. So you're going to have to look for savings elsewhere also. And there are a lot of union contracts that get negotiated. For example, there's the one being negotiated with the teachers now. And the city's going to have to take a very serious look at its outlays and its liabilities and be able to actually stand up to some of the public unions and say, look, there's no money here. We can't be negotiating raises. We have to be negotiating pay freezes and perhaps even pay cuts because there's just no money to pay this stuff anymore. There's no money to fund the future liabilities and the pensions. So that's some place where the city could really start saving money is its union contracts and, lowering headcount wherever they can because there's just not enough money to pay for all the city employees and all the services that the city currently supplies and the long-term liabilities in the pensions.
And we've got about a minute and a half left in this segment. And you and I have gone across the state talking about the governor's turnaround agenda. We've been on panels together. We've discussed this quite a bit. Give me a couple of points in the governor's turnaround agenda that can ultimately impact the revenue side. In other words, grow the economy, bring more jobs here, bring more economic opportunity here, and as a consequence, have more people living here, getting paid, and then revenues will be raised by the fact that the economy has grown. In a minute, take me through a couple of the main points of that and how that can be done, and if the General Assembly got reasonable, what the governor could accomplish through that agenda.
Well, one right off the top that speaks to Chicago is the workers' compensation problem because it addresses two sides of the equation here. One, we know that we have manufacturers leaving Chicago in the Chicago area, and one of the issues they say is because the workers' compensation costs are so high. So that would improve economic growth, increase tax revenue. The other side of that for the city is the city pays out massive amounts of money to city employees for workers' compensation, around $100 million per year. That's out of line with big cities across America. So the workers' compensation issue, which the governor really pushes on, is an issue where you increase economic growth and you reduce government spending. And that's something that Chicago would really benefit from if political leaders would get on board with passing reforms to the workers' compensation system. But other reforms like the collective bargaining changes that the governor wants in order to have a property tax freeze, it would basically allow local governments to take issues out of collective bargaining, such as pensions and wages.
Yeah, I also think that if the governor got his way on a property tax freeze that would allow businesses to relocate here without paying heavily on property taxes would also make a huge difference. And hopefully, eventually, he'll get some of this stuff done.